We want to talk about chapter 1 of Russell's Problems of Philosophy. And I'm so glad that Gus is here because I wanted to dedicate chapter 1 to Gus. Did you get a chance to listen to my read aloud, Gus? I don't know if Gus is with us. It might as well be called What is Table, What is Chair? I thought it was perfect for Gus. I think each chapter in this book has someone from Google Plus that I can dedicate it to. This one goes out to Gus. And Mikolash, I don't know if we've ever actually talked, so welcome.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I used to go by, I had the username Thing in the Ice.
Oh.
But I spend most of my times on Discord. So.
Okay. All right. Well, so did anybody get a chance to read or listen to chapter 1?
I have to tell the truth. I did not.
That's all right. Okay. So
I was just gonna say I didn't watch your video, but I had a copy of the book, so I had a glance at the first chapter.
Okay, so in that chapter, he introduces the idea of sense data, and he does it through what I think is called perceptual variation argument against naive realism. So there are a bunch of sort of arguments or problems that make it so that it really seems like naive realism just can't be right. That we really can't just perceive objects in the real world directly. This one, he kind of goes, well, as you walk around the room, you look at the table, and something changes. Something looks different from different angles as you walk around. But the table didn't change, but something changed. So what is it that changed? Well, it's the appearance that changed. The thing that I saw changed. The table didn't change, so that has to mean that I didn't really see the table. I only saw the appearance of the table. So then he gives a name to this appearance, and the name is sense data. So I kind of looked on Wikipedia because it's not really super clear in this little chapter whether he's saying that sense data has to be in the mind. To me, it's kind of neutral. But I think in general, the idea is that sense data are in the mind. So what you really perceive is sense data. You don't perceive the actual objects. So
what is the argument?
What do we think?
What is the inference that we do not perceive the actual objects themselves?
What is the what?
What is the argument for why we do not perceive objects themselves?
Well, in this chapter, he just says, think about this when you look at a table, and sort of gives the different appearances. Like, you know, when you look at a table and you're standing above the table, even if the table's perfectly rectangular, the side that's closest to you is going to look longer than the side that's farthest from you and stuff like that. But there are other arguments. There's the argument from hallucination, where it just doesn't seem like you really can stick with direct realism or naive realism. So there's the bent stick one. You guys know about the bent stick one. If you have a stick, right, and you are directly aware of something, stick in water, the stick looks bent. To be directly aware of something that's bent. But there isn't anything physically bent, right? The stick is straight. So what you're aware of has got to be some kind of non-physical thing. So if that's true, then that's probably true in real cases too. So that means that you really shouldn't be thinking that you're directly aware of non-physical things, even when you're not looking at something that's bent because of water. It's the same idea with the coin. You can turn a coin so that it looks like it's not circular but looks elliptical, or even like a line if you turn it completely facing you. So all of these things are things that you are immediately aware of that aren't the object. So that must mean that you're not aware of the object. So what are you aware of then? Well, let's call whatever it is that you're aware of sense data. Talk about is your personal internal experience, and that's actually what you see.
I have a response to that, but go ahead, people. Let's get the ball rolling.
Okay. Well, what do you think of that?
It sounds question-begging to me.
Okay, how so?
Because from the fact that something appears X to me, so I'm the subject, I'm immediately aware that something appears in some way to me. I don't think it follows that that thing is in that way.
Well, would you feel comfortable saying you can't know that the way it really is because of these circumstances, because of these strange instances or examples?
Well, I'm just saying that I have an explanation for why an object might, for instance, a straw in a glass of water might appear bent, but I don't have to believe that the objects of my awareness are bent. I don't think that because, so the objects of my awareness are not, it's not the objects of my awareness that are bent. I'm making I can be mistaken in my inference based on my perception that the straw is bent, but that's an inference, and I can be right or wrong about that. Maybe I can't even know if it's bent or not because I don't have access to it directly to do the test. But I'm just saying that from the fact that something appears to me to be bent, it doesn't follow that it is bent.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I would say.
Would you say that you don't feel comfortable saying that you really actually see the object itself? So
Well, I see the object.
It doesn't necessarily follow that just because it appears bent, that means that I don't see the object.
Well, I can remember even as a little kid coming on this problem of a straw or an object in a glass of water. And I can sort of visualize even where I was. And it never occurred to me that the straw was actually bent. I looked at it and you could see that it's actually shifted over either to the left or the right, several millimeters.
Right.
And it never occurred to me that the object was bent. It just, I never reached that conclusion. So it seems to me to be kind of an odd analogy to make, because nobody thinks that straws are bent when they're in water.
Right. I agree that nobody thinks that straws are bent when they're in water. But what if there was a situation where I don't see how, well, the argument is that direct realism can't explain some things. And the examples, this is one example, right? The bent stick and the coin turned at an angle, and just the fact that, walking around the room, the thing you're looking at seems to change, even if you know that the actual thing isn't changing. Then there's also total hallucinations, right? In the case of a total hallucination, let's just grant that the way it feels, the phenomenology of it, can be exactly the same in the case when someone's hallucinating an object and in the case when someone's actually looking at an object. So if those two experiences are exactly the same in the way that they are experienced, how can you explain that with direct realism? Because there's nothing there that is causing, if you will, that experience in the case of a hallucination.
Well, the direct realist reply to this would be
it's like you need to deposit that something can cause this experience, and that thing, in the case of a hallucination, for example, has got to be a non-physical thing. But if the experience is exactly the same, then why wouldn't you apply whatever it is that you're going to postulate to the real case too?
My understanding is that the direct realist response is that just because, let's say, X and Y are phenomenally indistinguishable, it doesn't follow that they are ontologically indistinguishable. So we have the phenomenology of Lady Macbeth, and she sees, is this a dagger I see before me? She's hallucinating a dagger, and it's phenomenally indistinguishable from a real dagger.
Right. The argument goes
to her
that Macbeth is seeing something, but it can't be a dagger. So it's got to be something else, and let's call that other thing sense data. And that's actually what we see.
Well, direct realists reject the idea of sense data. They would say we simply, the objects of our perception are just immediately available to us, and that there's no intermediary in sense datum. So the direct realist would say, and I'm sort of sympathetic to it. I'm taking that position in this discussion.
Sure.
As something that I am I'm not entirely sure, but I'm taking that position at this point in time. So the reply would simply be that the fact that something is phenomenally indistinguishable from the veridical case, it doesn't follow that they're ontologically indistinguishable. That would be the argument to counter the.
You would just say it doesn't
counter
follow
the objection. Yeah, that would be the argument to counter the objection from whoever is objecting.
Well, something seems weird about it to me, because it seems to imply, and maybe I don't understand it exactly right, but it seems to imply this idea that you're seeing the experience. And I don't think that that's right. I don't think you perceive the experience. I think that that's some kind of mistaken, I don't know what's in language or something that you have this internal experience, but it's not true that that's what you perceive. Data are objects in the mind or mind-dependent appearances.
Well, that's one of the objections to sense datum, as I understand it, isn't it? Is that it sort of leads to an infinite regress? I mean, do I need sense datum to perceive sense datum?
Right, that's what it seems like to me. Then you have the problem of the movie theater, right? So if we're stuck behind a movie theater so that we can never see the real objects, all we can see are the appearances of the real objects, like we're watching some movie, and we can't get out of the movie theater, then we're seeing, then something in us is seeing.
Yeah, Plato's cave.
That's right. And that seems to me to be a pretty big problem, and I don't know how they answer that. I'm glad that Aaron came in, because Aaron...
Or brains in a vat, I suppose. We could be brains in a vat.
Right. But
in a computer simulator. We're in the matrix.
That's true.
Yeah.
Could we go back to the...
there's a more scientific way to say it, right? That still seems to me to give a problem for direct realists, right? It's sort of this... It seems as though what we've discovered so far in science means direct realism can't be right. Right? Because it seems like you never really can see the real world. That what's happening is you are perceiving the impact that the real world has on your mind, on your brain's machinery. Right? So you look at something, your nerve endings get stimulated, it triggers neuron firings all the way through these layers in your brain, and eventually that becomes this qualitative experience. And that's what you actually see. There aren't any actual things. Well, there could be things in the world, but maybe that's not what you see, right? Like if you look at color, don't we all think that there is no objects don't actually have color?
Right. It's how they interact.
All there is
how they interact with light reflectances.
That's right. Like so, the object is just molecules, and they absorb certain light waves and reflect other light waves, and that stimulates your optic nerves in your brain, and eventually it creates a visual experience, and that's what you actually see.
Other people can go too.
So I had a question about how in the bent straw example, so you have a straw that appears bent when it's submerged, but if you can look at a straw that looks bent in a glass from one direction, and it appears bent there. Another person could be on the other side of the glass and see it bent in the opposite direction or a completely different direction. And if what we are seeing is actually the real thing, if we're directly seeing the world instead of seeing a representation of the world, then it seems to me that we have a contradiction there. That on the one hand, the straw is bent to the right, on the other hand, the straw is bent to the left. But two people directly seeing the same object bent in the opposite direction. So to me, I don't know how you would reconcile that with realism.
Well, let's move on. Let's assume you can't reconcile it. Let's just go with it for a while and assume it can't be reconciled. Like, there's just got to be these appearances, and there just aren't.
I don't understand why direct realism commits one to some sort of non-relativistic, non-indexical accounts of things like left and right. Because it seems to me that that's clearly resolved by saying it's indexical.
Well, it seems like all perception is indexical. Isn't that right? I mean, you can't perceive something unless it's immediately right there in front of you. To be here and now. So I guess I don't see what the fact that, at least if it's a fact, if I'm right, that whatever's in front of you, but perceptions, let's just think of seeing. Those that's in the here and now, why that matters, how does that defeat this idea that if it looks one way to one person and looks another way to another person, then there's no way to know which way it really is, or if it really is in any way? Josh?
Yeah, just 1 sec, I'm getting in my car.
Well,
right, so we can account for the fact that the appearances are different to people on different sides of the cup holding the straw and the water is simply to the fact that they're on different sides, and we can account for that as being, there's a single object out there, and simply viewing it from different angles gives it a different appearance. I mean, I don't conclude, if I look at a penny from an angle, it appears elliptical to me, but it doesn't follow that the penny is elliptical.
I agree it doesn't follow that the penny is elliptical. But it seems like there's a problem here. It seems like, even though I agree with you, right, it doesn't follow that the penny is elliptical. And we use other senses to sort of get a feel for what the penny's probably really like. It seems like we're always going to be stuck in the probably really like.
Well, if we take the indexical account, then it's almost like a relativist position, where what it is, it really is. Well, I don't know if you would say it's really bent.
It's
I mean,
definitely not bent. I mean,
it's not a bent. Yeah, it's not a bent object.
Right, because you can just lift it up out of the water and see it's not bent.
Yeah.
So what's this bentness that we're seeing? It's got to be something non-physical, I think, is the way it goes, right? That's how the argument goes.
Yeah. Yes. Like the argument is that in order to separate out appearances from, what is really there, you would say that what we're seeing is a representation of reality instead of reality itself, and that allows for a mistaken perception that doesn't make reality itself weird and relativistic.
Right. So there's this idea that the sense data resemble the object, right? And that's what you're getting at. That they give you a kind of picture or like image or representation of the object, and that's what you see.
I mean, I think we see a representation of an object, but I don't think that we necessarily have to invoke that there really is something there that it resembles. I don't think that would follow.
You don't think there's anything there?
Yeah, I mean, unless you take it, you stay a realist about objective physical reality, then yeah, you could take that view. I think that was whose view was that? Locke.
Right. Okay. So you're saying
I think that was
you're
John
saying
Locke's view. Yeah.
So John Locke's view is the one where he stays a realist about the objects.
Yeah. So he separates it into primary and secondary qualities. So yeah, the primary quality would be the actual spatiotemporal aspect of it, the solidity, and the length, width, height, stuff like that. Height.
Right.
And
the secondary qualities are like color, the sound, the taste, the smell, that kind of thing.
Yep.
And so he says that the primary qualities really resemble the object, and so we can know about those.
Mm-hmm.
And that the secondary qualities are like
they're subjective
powers.
to a certain
They're
extent.
like powers,
They're what now?
but they're illusion. They're like powers of the primary qualities.
Oh, yeah.
So they,
Mm-hmm.
the object causes you to have these experiences, but you can still know about reality because there are these primary qualities: the shape, the size, the number, the speed, stuff like that, and those resemble the actual object.
Yeah.
But I don't know why. What about that would mean that they resemble the object? How do you guarantee that they resemble the object? It seems like you're just saying so.
I'm not sure. I don't know if he argued for why. He may have, he may not have. I'm not sure.
Now, you think, I think, this is one of the reasons why I was really glad you're here, that claiming that primary qualities resemble the object doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And so you think that there aren't any objects at all.
Yeah.
That all there is
You can
experience.
Yeah, so like you can explain everything about the primary quality itself in terms of secondary qualities. Like everything that you know about the shape and the solidity and the size of the car, or like a car that's sitting outside, or any object that there's out there, you can describe it exhaustively by appealing only to secondary qualities, which are supposed to be subjective. Even length, width, and height will be like the only reason that you really sort of see an image with depth is in terms of different colors. It's like a painting can be painted as if it's 3D, but the three-dimensional nature of what's in the painting is achieved merely by having different shades and hues of different colors so they appear three-dimensional.
I think
And
I think the point is that when people have this confused notion that when like they want to take that these primary qualities are not, that they're sort of like objective in nature, that there's like like a fact that there's something is 3 feet and
Yeah.
something being 3 feet long means something irrespective of the experiential predicates. But I think that there's nothing. I agree that there's nothing more to the object as we understand it besides our experiential predicates. But I'm a transcendental idealist because I think there's something that sets the fact that such that we experience it a certain way. So I think that there's like a noumenal realm to that, and I don't think that those can be characterized experientially. I don't know what the direct realists want to say about that.
So why would you think that there's a thing? How come you're not just a straight idealist?
I think it's a theoretical posit what's going to explain. I just don't think it would be random that every time you look at an object that's red colored, it's going to appear the same way to you. I think there's something that constrains us viewing it as red, and I think that there's also something that constrains our cognitive faculties, such that notions of time and space are built into them.
I mean, on idealism, there really isn't a way to give an account of why experience is one way rather than another. Because in order to account for what constrains experience, you have to posit something external to experience.
I would agree with that. I do think that though that the mystery is there. Like there's a mystery that you have to solve, and that positing the object itself, like a substance dualist would, the way that you would end up solving it, something fixes that content some way or another. And so one of the ways that I think substance dualism doesn't make sense is because once you posit the object, say you posit the object and you say that there's a mind-independent object there, and it's playing some kind of causal role to you having an experience of it. What fixes you always you can never really get to what it would explain content.
The reason it's an idealist picture is if you sort of look at, it's just like if you look at instrumentalism in science or something, is because what it's going to be is a necessary theoretical posit for your model of experience. Like it's going to be something that we can't make sense of our experiences without. So you're going to have to give a negative account. That's why Kant didn't think that you could predicate things of the noumena.
I think there's a clear way to think about it, right? If you were to imagine that, if you were just to think about experiencing sensations, right? Some experiences you have, you can will, right? You can just decide you want to think about some image or sound or whatever, and you might see it in your mind's eye or hear it. But the thing is that there are experiences that assail you, right? If you look at a tree, whether you want to see a tree or not, you're probably going to see a tree, right? You might not even expect there to be a tree there. You'll just turn your head, and all of a sudden, in your experience, will be the image of a tree, right? So for that to have an explanation, you have to actually posit something external to experience. Otherwise, the reason why you see a tree, there is actually no reason. So I think there's a point which has been, I'm not sure if it's been recognized in philosophy, that idealism is basically the same thing as total randomness. It's basically the absence of, it would entail total randomness. Because in order for there to be explanatory facts that explain experience, they'd have to be external to experience. That's why I don't think idealism is tenable.
Well, isn't the reason that we see a tree because the tree is independent of us? It seems straightforward to me.
That's the intuition, but I think the point about it being transcendental is that it doesn't really make sense of us to predicate experiential properties of it absent experience. So when we understand length and width and height to be experiential predicates, it doesn't make sense to say a tree is 8 feet long independent of how we experience spatial extension, right? So the tree is not the tree is not 8 feet long independent of your experience in a way. There's a way in which our conception of the tree is characterized by our experiences of length and width and height. And then there's another aspect to that phenomenon that we call the noumenal, and it's in virtue of that we're saying that is what sets it such that we experience it that way. But Jack, what if someone were to bite the bullet and just say, why take it to just be random, that our experiences are consistent in such a way?
Well, I mean, you mean that, well, I don't think we could really make sense of, sorry about the noise. I don't think we could really make sense of intentionality without positing law-like connections and things like that. So, I mean, there's a more sophisticated critique of idealism that would come through the analysis of what it would actually mean to be an agent, and it would involve that there would have to be a third-person point of view, and there couldn't be a third-person point of view if there wasn't something external to experience and so forth.
Well, see, I think that there's two mysteries that end up having to be solved the same way. You either have the mystery of the form of these laws, whatever this law-like connection would be, the form of the law would end up having to fix a particular kind of content to a particular physical state of affairs, or some, I shouldn't say physical, but some state of affairs. Or you have something external that would simply dictate content. Like you have a mystery about having, the exact right laws in place that would give you this sort of coherent experience, or you have a mystery about experiences themselves being coherent with each other. Like on both views, you end up always having this mystery about why the experiential content or mental content that you have is just the way it is, instead of being some other way, some random way.
Well, doesn't the object itself dictate the content? The object and the conditions of its surroundings. The tree is red because the sun is setting and is casting a brilliant reddish light on everything. So the tree is red because it appears to be red, but I don't think that the tree is red, because I know that in the daytime, when the sun is directly overhead, it's pretty green.
Right, but when you apply that to a
those conditions are external to me. They don't depend on me. They depend on the object, and the object is what determines how it appears.
right, but when you apply the actual state of affairs in the relationship between you as a perceiver of the object and the object itself, you're going to end up at some point positing some kind of law-like connection between you and the object that says that when a certain state of affairs comes to be, like you know, when a photon hits a certain receptor, or when you are in the appropriate presence of a certain kind of object, however the law is, you end up having the law fixing the content. The form of whatever law that there is would have to have content in it. And so you either have randomness with respect to experiences themselves, so the reason that I see a red object is sort of inexplicable, or you have randomness with the laws that give you the content. So I think the mystery is on any position, and that positing the object there, it pushes the mystery one step back, but it doesn't actually solve it.
I'm not sure I understand, to be perfectly honest. I'm not sure. The fact that there are photons that hit the object and bounce off of it and eventually go into my eye and hit my retina. So there's this long causal chain between me. Wouldn't that simply necessitate that there's a certain regularity rather than randomness? If it was a random, then I don't know if I could perceive anything. I need a certain regularity in how the world operates for me to consistently perceive the photons that are emanating from that object, or in the case of touch, you know, its surface texture, or in the case of taste, you know, how it affects my taste buds, right?
Yeah. The reason that I don't think
lemons are always going to be sour because of the nature of lemons.
Yeah. The reason I don't think that would I don't think it would work that way, because I think that perceptions, like for example, my perception right now is of a room, in a particular corner of my room that I'm looking at right now. And so when I perceive that, I sort of perceive it as one full experience. And if I was to try to come up with any kind of law-like explanation of my experience, I would have I'd have whatever physical state of affairs there is, whatever physical description of my brain, and I would, at some point, if I'm thinking of the form that this law would take, it would have to say at some point that when you have this particular kind of state, then an experience of this sort will obtain. And you know, that kind of the content itself, it doesn't seem to me to be the kind of thing that you could expect to be regular, without just sort of assuming that it would be, you know, it would be as strange for experiential content to have laws that just sort of make them regular or intelligible. It would be as random as idealism, it would seem to me, because you always end up having these laws of the particular type fixing a particular kind of content.
I guess I don't understand your objection, because isn't it simply the case that we do have laws governing these things, as laws of perspective, laws of optics, the optics of my eye, laws of how things behave in response to the light hitting them, or to any other kind of laws, applicable laws so it just seems to me that it is in fact the case that they do operate by these laws, and that the consistency and regularity of these laws are why I can see things.
I mean, I agree that they're consistent and regular, but I don't see why. So if you can think about this, maybe there are laws that make experience consistent and regular in light of a consistent and regular physical world that you see, and so that you solve the mystery of why your experiences are consistent and regular by saying that there is a mind-independent world that is also consistent and regular, and that there are laws that relate the regular world in a regular way to your experiences. But you could also say that, well, what if there are just psychophysical laws that just deal with experiences by themselves in a regular and law-like way, so that all the things that need to happen for an intelligible mental life happen, right?
Well, so Aaron, you think that there are these regularities and that it's consistent and that the tree looks like it's always in the same spot. But what reason do you have? What do you have that do you think that there's nothing causing these regularities? Or if you think something does cause them, what is that?
I mean, I think that it's basically, I just take a theistic perspective on it, because I think that you end up having to assume that these, whatever the laws are, whether they're a relationship between your mind and an object, or a relationship between different minds having experiences where they relate to each other and things like that, like an idealist picture. I think that you end up having to solve that mystery at some point to say the psychophysical laws are fine-tuned. I don't see a way that would be, or that would invoke some explanation of the fine-tuning of the psychophysical laws, and I don't think that there's a way to get around it by invoking that there's a mind-independent object there, because now you need a law about the relationship between your mind and the object, where on idealism you just need a law about the experiences themselves and the relationships.
So when I asked you what you think is causing regularities, you sort of just said, well, I take this theistic perspective and I don't see how real objects, theistic perspective that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think you have to invoke theism to explain the fine-tuning of the psychophysical laws, but that's not why I'm an idealist.
What do you mean by the psychophysical laws? I'm not sure I know what you're referring to.
Yeah, the laws that relate you to you as an observer to the world that you observe. So like
I don't see why you would need theism to have an explanation. Yeah. I don't even see how theism could be an explanation for that.
It wouldn't be an explanation for the presence of the laws, like someone trying to say that you couldn't have consciousness come from something that was material or something like that. You know, but it would be, theism would have to be invoked to explain the fine-tuning of the physical laws. It couldn't be chance.
I guess I don't understand what you mean fine-tuning.
Yeah, I agree.
Right, but well, the way that I see it, you end up with having laws that fix content, and the content will always seem to be somewhat out of place and arbitrary in terms of what kind of content could follow what kind of object. Unless you have a regress of laws that would dictate what kind of laws there could be about mental content or whatever. But like.
Well, go ahead.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I thought you were done. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So like say, and this probably wouldn't be the actual form of a psychophysical law, but say that there's a law that says that when I'm in the correct, appropriate presence of a cell phone, and it's in front of my eyes, and the light bounces off of it in the right way, and hits my retinas and does all the brain processes.
I don't know what you mean by correct there.
Well, I mean, like with my eyes open and looked in the correct position, and with appropriate amount of light and all that kind of stuff.
No, but I'm not understanding what you mean by correct. Are you talking about correct perception?
Yes.
Yeah, but see, on transcendental idealism, there wouldn't be such a thing as correct or incorrect perception. So that problem wouldn't arise. I don't even really know how to make sense of the notion of correct or incorrect perceptions.
I mean, you would understand the difference between having an unintelligible, jumbled mess of perceptions that don't make any sense and aren't meaningful.
Well, I don't think perceptions are meaningful or not. I don't think it's something that applies to perception. Right.
I think meaning most of the time has something to do with like propositional content.
Hmm.
But that aside, you're just saying a bunch of random experiences that don't seem cohesive. Is that sort of the idea?
Right. It's like I could like, let's
That's
say
not a problem with perceptions, right? That's a problem with cognition.
Yeah. I've been really, really drunk sometimes and had pretty jumbled perceptions.
well, that's not it's not really what
Is that what you,
my point is. My argument is that let's say there was no designer. If what we have to have are these laws that relate the observer to the object, and that these laws fix the content of whatever his perception is going to be, whether it resembles an object is irrelevant.
Where's the part where a designer can explain something that can't be explained otherwise? How would you establish that? Because see, I don't think. See, first of all, we agree, right? There couldn't actually be evidence of a designer, right? We agree on that, right?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Do you understand what I mean by evidence?
You mean in the context of the mind-body problem, or
No,
in
in
the context of...
any context. What I could mean by evidence, at least any empirical context. Do you understand what evidence could mean?
I think so.
So evidence is something that's predicted on a hypothesis, right?
Sure.
So the design hypothesis doesn't actually predict anything, right?
Right, but I don't think that the argument appeals to it in that way.
So what is it, an a priori argument of some kind?
No, it's an argument. It's the premise that we're sort of forced to take as true. It relies on a premise that we're already committed to. So I don't think that I would have to have evidence for the premise in order to make the argument.
I'm just trying to understand what kind of an argument it is, right?
Yeah, I mean, it would be...
You're trying to posit a designer as an explanation for some phenomenon, right?
Yeah.
Now, I take it it's not an evidential argument, because you're not saying there's evidence for the existence of a designer, right?
I think it would constitute evidence for the existence of a designer.
Well, then the design hypothesis would have to predict the evidence, right? But the design hypothesis doesn't predict anything.
Are we talking about? Well, are you talking about the intelligent design argument? Like,
no.
Okay.
I'm talking about an explanation for the finely tuned psychophysical laws.
But you're saying that there's an apparent phenomenon, finely tuned psychophysical laws. I don't understand what those are or are supposed to be, but let's just grant for the sake of argument there is some such observed phenomenon, right?
Sure.
For that to be evidence for the existence of a designer, the design hypothesis would have to predict that phenomenon. But design hypothesis doesn't predict that phenomenon.
I would disagree. I think that
it's not consistent with the existence of a designer for there not to be finely tuned psychophysical laws, whatever those are.
No, I would put it a different way. If you use
But I don't see why you would have to put it a different way. If it's not inconsistent, then that means it doesn't actually predict the phenomenon.
No, that's not true at all. I mean,
so
you could have two competing theories that both predict.
We agree, right, that evidence is something that's expected on a hypothesis, right?
Sure.
Is it expected on the design hypothesis that we should encounter finely tuned psychophysical laws?
Look, I think the idea is something like if we were aware of all the relevant facts, like the way evidence works is like, we only have a small portion of observable reality and stuff, and so we can't take into account all of the facts. But if we were aware of all of the relevant facts, then we could reason a priori to any event, right? And the reason we could reason that way is because we know sort of like certain entailments given certain conditions, you know. So like if you're aware of like basically the ceteris paribus clause is the all things being equal, you know, like if you have some hypothesis like Jack likes to use a star in some vicinity in space, you know, he likes to say, well, if there were a star here and a set of ice cubes here, we would expect all things being equal, and the ceteris paribus clauses are important there. What we expect all things being equal is the ice to melt, and we reason that from our sort of conception of stars and our conception of ice and so on and so forth. And so that's why we want to say that you could sort of reason a priori to some of these conclusions, but from the fact of a designer, right? It's not as if you can reason a priori to anything in particular, because a designer could design anything. You could also not design anything. You know, like you could refrain from designing anything if you wanted to. So I think the point is that it doesn't generate that specific predictive expectations unless you build into the hypothesis that those would come out. So like you can say, well, there exists a designer with the desire and the capabilities of generating these psychophysical laws, but that would be just like any other ad hoc explanation wherein you just build in the phenomenon to be expected into the hypothesis.
I think that the way that any design argument usually works is you compare the relative adequacy of the explanation, or the relative probability that you would see on one theory, and compare that to either some physical necessity or some chance, and then the design hypothesis should come out superior. And so, as an inference to the best explanation, you take design.
The point is, it doesn't actually explain the phenomenon if it doesn't predict it. That's the problem.
I don't know what you mean by predict. So, like, just, as in just specifically?
Well, no. So, like, there's this thing like a prediction is just an expected observation given the truth of something else. So, like if my mother went to the store, you know, I should expect she'd tell me or something like that. All things being equal, and the all things being equal clause in there, what that means is that, you know, I've called her and I asked her, and she has reliable cognitive faculties, and she can tell me, you know, like I have reason to believe she's reporting truthfully and stuff. So what I would expect if that hypothesis were true, that my mother went to the store, is that if I called her, she would tell me that, you know, that's going to be a piece of evidence for that claim. And so it's an observation that we would expect if the hypothesis were true, you know. And so the thing about the psychophysical laws is say there's a designer, why would we expect that would be true? There's another issue I want to address besides that, but we'll just talk about that issue for right now.
I don't think it's out of step at all for a designer to design.
We're not saying it's out of step. We're saying it's not predicted by the hypothesis.
Right, but it is out of step with chance, and it is out of step with physical necessity.
No, that doesn't follow. And it's beside the point, right?
Well, it doesn't follow. I haven't explained why it follows from chance that it would be irrational to even expect them to be.
Chance doesn't generate predictive expectations either.
Right, like total randomness is just that doesn't generate any predictions. That's just saying that there's not an explanation.
Right, but that would be the competing alternative.
The point is,
right?
you are claiming that the existence of apparently finely tuned psychophysical laws, whatever those are evidence for a designer, right?
Right.
Now, evidence is what is expected on a hypothesis, right? But the design hypothesis generates no expectations, so there can't be evidence for it.
No, that's not true.
So what is it that you think evidence is if it's not what's expected on a hypothesis?
It's if you say what is expected on a hypothesis, if you're saying that design in and of itself wouldn't predict the precise psychophysical laws that we see today.
It doesn't predict anything. It doesn't predict anything at all.
I'm gonna agree. See, look, you can agree that if you build into your hypothesis, it's going to raise the probability of this outcome. But that's just going to be a sort of trivialism, you know, like you're going to say something like, well, if there's a designer who had the intention and the capability of designing these exact psychophysical laws, then these exact psychophysical laws are what we would expect. Yeah, that's going to be trivially true, you know, given the nature of the hypothesis. But the problem with that is that you can construct an infinite number of those types of explanations that just generate the prediction of the phenomenon in question, but nothing else. And then there's nothing that's going to give you a reason to accept one hypothesis over any other hypothesis that would generate that expectation, you know. So like, look, like what if I were to just say, with the physical laws example, what if I were to just say that there's just a law that raises the probability of these hypotheses being true, you know? You wouldn't have a way of competing with that because I've just built into my hypothesis that the phenomenon that's expected would also be expected if there were a law of such a type. So it's similar to say, if there were a designer of such a type, then we would expect these. And I'm saying, if there were a law of such a type, then we would expect the same phenomenon. So there's no reason to prefer one or the other because you simply built into the hypothesis the observation in question.
So basically, there's a dilemma, right? The dilemma is either you have a hypothesis that doesn't predict anything, in which case there can't be evidence for it.
I disagree with that.
Or alternatively, you have a hypothesis that's ad hoc. Now, you could get out of the dilemma by giving independent justification for the hypothesis, right? But I don't see how you're going to be able to do that.
Well, I could. I just don't think that it would be necessary. I think that
well, you'd have to show where we're wrong in our reasoning, right? So you understand.
So far, you haven't let me explain.
Well, but do you understand why evidence is what's expected on a hypothesis? I mean, why is it that rapid melting of an ice tray in some vicinity of space-time, right, would be taken as evidence that there's a star in the neighborhood? If it weren't the case that stars, in virtue of being very hot objects, right, would be expected to melt ice trays in their vicinity.
Right, but if you look at what you're saying here, you're looking at a specific example and then explaining the specific one by appealing to a general law.
I'm just asking you. I'm asking a specific question about the star. I'm asking a specific question about the star. Why?
Right, I know. I realize that.
But you're not allowing me. You're not answering that question. The question.
Right. Let me explain the problem here. Let me explain the problem. The second law of thermodynamics, or any of the laws, or the four major laws of thermodynamics taken together, none of them make any specific predictions about any glass of ice. None of them make any specific predictions that there's going to be a star in the vicinity of anything, or that any particular object is going to melt. And yet, when you see an object that melts, you would appeal to those four laws as being some kind of confirmation that those laws take place.
That's not answering the question that I asked you, right? The question I asked you was, if it weren't the case that it was because rapid melting is expected in the vicinity of stars, right? Why would the observation of rapid melting be taken to be evidence for the presence of a star?
Because when it comes to a designer or an agent, just because the mere existence of an
I
agent
didn't
doesn't...
ask you about an agent. I asked you
You're
about the
not letting
star.
me finish a
But
sentence.
I'm not talking about agents. I'm talking about the star.
I'm talking about designers.
Yeah, we're dealing with another example. We'll get back to the
Right,
designers.
but what your point is that a designer by itself doesn't make a prediction or lead to any expectations,
Okay,
and I'm saying that's wrong.
before we get to that, okay, let's clarify the point about the star. Do you take rapid melting as evidence for a star? Rapid melting in the vicinity of some hypothesized star
Sure.
to be evidence for that star?
I would say that a star is a good explanation for the melting.
Okay, fine. Now,
It could be.
for it to be evidence for that, is it evidence for that in virtue of the fact that it's expected in the vicinity of stars that if you place an ice tray in the region, we should see rapid melting in virtue of how hot stars are?
Sure.
Great. Now, what I'm asking you is, right, if you don't think that evidence is constituted by its being what's expected on a hypothesis, right, what else is it?
It can be, as long as I take you to mean something. When you say expected, that you're not being particular or specific on that word.
I don't understand.
Right. So just like nothing about any of the four laws of thermodynamics don't make any kind of implication whatsoever about any particular glass of ice. Like you wouldn't say, oh, okay, there are these four laws of thermodynamics, and then you would say, oh, well, then I should expect to find in this particular quadrant of the galaxy this particular glass of ice, and I should expect to see it melting.
Look, I've asked you a very simple question, right? Which is simply, if you don't take evidence to be what's expected on a hypothesis,
what do you mean by expected? Define expected.
You don't understand what it means to say that rapid melting is expected on the star hypothesis?
There are two senses in which I can understand that question.
Well, Jack, he agreed with you like a couple of minutes ago on the question of, is it expected on the star hypothesis that you'd see rapid melting of ice?
Yeah. So why is that obscure?
Yeah.
I'm using expected in that sense.
Okay, is it expected in an absence of design for any kind of specific set of laws that would cater toward convenient outcomes for human beings?
No.
Right. Okay, so then if there is,
but I don't see the relevance. I don't see the relevance of that to my question, right? I'm trying to get you to explain to me what you think evidence is if you don't think evidence is what's expected on a hypothesis.
I don't know what the heck you mean by that question.
So you understand what I mean when I say that the rapid melting is expected on the star hypothesis?
Yes, but you're speaking
so
of...
you
okay.
understand. So you understand
apply that
what
to a theory of history. No. Apply that to a theory of history or economics.
You understand what expected means there, right?
Yes, because there's a deterministic kind of law of physics involved there.
We understand
you wouldn't apply that kind of reasoning to history. You wouldn't apply that kind of reasoning to anything to do with human beings.
Why wouldn't I apply it to history?
I've been AFK for a minute. What's happening?
He's saying that in historical hypotheses, we don't actually expect certain things to be true given some historical hypothesis to be true.
Well, yeah,
that's not what I'm saying.
Oh, so then you do understand what I mean by expected in historical cases as well, right? I'm saying that some observations would be expected given some hypothesis being true. What's obscure about that?
So I think what would, like with something like a historical artifact or something, if you, let's say you had some textual interpretation of some like hieroglyphics or something like that, there would be a historical explanation for the meaning of that text. And so what you would do is you would generate predictions from that about, like, if we were to find other artifacts, we ought to find symbols arranged in such a way that's consistent with this hypothesis. And so I think that there would be confirmation of that same kind in historical cases as well. It's
Are we trying to determine the adequate methodology for abduction?
No, we're trying to settle the question of what it would mean for there to be evidence for a hypothesis.
Oh, I see. Keep going.
so, Aaron, do you think that? I mean, is there anywhere where you disagree with the analysis of what evidence is?
I don't know. I can explain perfectly coherently what the reasoning is for the inference to design, but it's being obscured because I keep being asked questions about methodology with ambiguous terms.
You're the one who's
Let's
claiming
just hold on a sec. Just give us. Apart from that, we'll get to the inference that you're dealing with in the first place. But if you just take on, I don't know what's obscure about the analysis that we've given, but assume that there is an obscurity. You would agree that on that account, there's the only way there could be evidence that could be evidence is if it was an observation that was predicted, that is to say, expected to be observed given the truth of that hypothesis, right?
Right. Well, it can be. There are two senses of the word expected here. One is an expectation that you're sitting there and you can make the prediction and then expect to find it. There's the other sense of word expected where it is perfectly consistent within the hypothesis for that kind of thing to take place.
I'm not sure what the difference is. When I say expected, right, we want to say, what should we see if this is true, right? If we look out into the world and this is true, what should we see? So that's going to be the same as, like, obviously there's going to be a whole series of background hypotheses that we're going to take true for the sake of argument, whatever, in any specific case. But, like, the point is that, like, let's say the hypothesis is something like there's let's say it's something like the light in my refrigerator went out. What should I see if that's the case? Well, if that's the case, then the next time I open my refrigerator, I should expect to see no light, right? And also, if I unscrew the light bulb, I should see that the filament is not in its correct place, and so on and so forth. So those would all be evidence that the light in my refrigerator has gone out.
Sure.
So that's all we're saying when we say expected or predicted is, what should we see if this hypothesis is true?
Right. But and this the way that I would, an analogous example wouldn't be, to me, something like your light in your refrigerator being out, but it would be like something along the lines of a broad physical law. So, like the laws of chemistry, for example, if they're true, what should we expect to see? Well, we're not going to have a particular specific expectation about specific chemical reactions in time. Although, if you came across a particular chemical reaction, you might explain it in terms of those of chemistry. But
I think the reason the laws are generalizable in those cases is because we want to say we've arrived at those laws in virtue of particular instances, and then offering hypotheses to explain those particulars, and then
right. But then I could interrupt and say, well, would you expect this particular reaction on it by invoking that these particular physical laws exist? And then you would say, well, I guess not. I guess I wouldn't expect to see this particular reaction in this particular moment in time of history as being somehow derived from these laws.
Well, no, I think
Right.
that I think the idea is that if you have a set of initial conditions, you can specify if, as long as you set the parameters. So, like, I'll give you an example. If I know the force of gravity, and I give a set, if I say if this hypothesis is true, right, that gravity is like the mass of the object plus the distance from another object, I should be able to expect, as long as I set the conditions of any particular example, then it will generate specific expectations. Like, I should expect to see satellites orbiting around and things like that.
Yeah, so I would agree with you there, but the thing is, the things that we should expect to see are a continued life of intelligibility, like a continued coherent life that would continue on with uniformity or with some kind of regularity. That would be confirmation that my idea is true, or that the design is there. Because
the design hypothesis is consistent with that being suspended.
Right, but it's much more. In fact, it's
no. The design hypothesis doesn't generate predictive expectations.
That's your assertion.
Well, show me, right, how starting from a design hypothesis you can predict outcomes, right, without plugging in specific motivations and capacities, right?
An aspect of the action of an agent is that it is it's action that is using some kind of means to achieve some kind of end.
Yeah, and so there's an infinity of possible ends, right? What ends might an agent not have?
Right, but we have to take my
You're
argument.
Not answering my question. What's an end that an agent might not have?
Something that's unintelligible, meaningless.
Why?
Just
Somebody can desire meaninglessness and chaos, and if they can contrive a way,
then it would be indistinguishable from the chance case.
So what? The point is that if they can desire it,
right?
And so if they can find a way to contrive to secure it, it's a possible end for them.
Sure, but my argument is, and you're going to interrupt me again.
Well, because you're not answering my question. I was asking you what ends are inconsistent with the existence of an agent.
It's not an implication of my argument that makes me have to say that. Because the nature of the argument is that the nature of the argument is that we are forced to take it as though it is designed by an agent that is capable of doing that.
Is the claim you're making that the apparent presence of finely tuned psychophysical laws, whatever those are, is evidence for the existence of a designer?
Yes.
Great. Now we need to understand what it is that you think evidence is if you don't think it's what we think evidence is.
Okay, we are already committed to something that can only be explained rationally.
That's not what I'm asking you. I'm asking you what you think evidence is. We've given an account of evidence.
You're either going to let me explain. You're either going to let me explain the argument and then say whatever kind of response you want to it, okay, or you're just going to continue to interrupt me.
I'll let you to explain the argument, but let me tell you in advance, right, that after you've explained the argument, if you haven't answered the question, what it is you think evidence is, I'm going to repeat the question. So you're going to waste everybody's time.
I don't care, because they'll hear the argument and they can decide whether or not your question means anything.
I will wait and then repeat the question after you haven't answered it. So go ahead.
Okay. So
I'd like to hear the way Aaron sees it.
Sure, let's hear it.
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So if you can think through your entire life at the sheer number of experiences that you've had, the number of situations that you have been in, and you can think of the number of different ways that the physical universe has been arranged, the objects in the physical universe, all of the objects that you've interacted with, think of the number of arrangements there are of those, and you think about how many brain states an individual human being has had. It doesn't matter whether or not you take a metaphysical position where the brain itself is an actual mind-independent object consisting of matter and molecules, or whether or not it is a kind of, that it's in terms of its experience or some noumenal object that's giving rise to it. But we see that brains and minds are correlated with these neural correlates, and they're very specific. We also see that perceptions and the objects that you perceive and your brain is correlated in a very specific, regular way. We also see that sometimes brains are not conscious. They don't correlate with a particular experience. And we see that other physical systems that we see are not correlated with physical systems either, or correlated with mind either. They don't have an experience when they see things. So the problem is that the electrochemical processes that are going on in your brain and in everyone else's brain, and the electrochemical things, the laws that they're obeying physically are the same laws that everything else that is not conscious are obeying. And there's no real explanation that is going to invoke the content of your mind as to why one molecule moves one way or the other. So you're not going to explain a physical event by invoking content, propositional content or any kind of perceptual content. You're never going to invoke that in your explanation. And so there's this sort of inexplicable relationship that is extremely specific that relates brains to minds and perceptions to those minds in an intelligible way that continues and persists throughout time. Each brain state over and over and over, continually, they're finely tuned. We know it's not a necessary relationship in the sense that all brains will always accurately perceive its surroundings. We know that because we are fallible. We have mistaken perceptions. We have mistaken beliefs, mistaken reasoning processes. We have lapses in judgment. We have dreams. We have hallucinations, so on and so forth. And we also know that it can't be chance, because if you say that it's chance, then there could be an infinite number of universes that persisted intelligibly up to this moment. But in the next moment, there are so many more ways that it could diverge than for it to continue as within the realm of expectation, that it's actually vastly more likely on chance that whatever kind of laws that are fixing the content of each particular mental state that we have, it's actually more likely that it would diverge radically from what we expect than for it to continue as we expect it to. And so because of the specificity with the electrochemistry and the way the mental state has to relate to very specific chemistry going on in your mind or in your brain, because of that specificity, and because there's nothing that we can appeal to about how the physics works that allows us to distinguish or take special attention to a brain in a particular kind of orientation, but it wouldn't be conscious if it's in a different kind of configuration. Because there's nothing that we could appeal to in that, and because it would be more likely on chance to diverge than for it to persist, then the best explanation actually is that they're finely tuned, or the best explanation for this fine tuning is that it was designed, that the universe itself has as an aspect of its design human agents, at least human agents, but some kind of sentient beings that would allow us to explain not only our own minds and the way that they relate to brains and the rest of the world, but other minds and other brains of other people. And if you don't have this, if you don't invoke this as an explanation, because of the nature of what minds are, you couldn't look out into the world and see and take a test of whether or not another brain is conscious or not. And because there's nothing you can invoke in terms of physics that would make brains special, then you either have some kind of weird special pleading against nature, and like an unguided nature, which would be blind to outcomes and specific convenient relationships between brains and minds, and would sort of be indifferent to whether or not things continued intelligibly or radically diverged from what our expectations would be. Then theism is the only really rational way forward, that you wouldn't be rational in expecting your perceptions to continue on as they exist, when it's actually, for all you know, like it's more likely that it diverges on any kind of view that doesn't take human perception as being designed to some degree.
Okay, well, I couldn't discern a valid argument of any form, inductive, abductive, or deductive, from what you said. But in any case, it wasn't an answer to my question, right? See, what you're saying, I take it, and you've affirmed this several times when I've asked you this, is that the apparent presence of what appear to be finely tuned psychophysical laws are evidence for a designer, right?
Right.
And I'm just trying to understand what you mean by that claim, because when we've given an account of evidence, right, you have rejected it. So we don't know what you're talking about when you say something is evidence for something else. And I've asked you numerous times just to tell me what it is you think evidence is. And you gave me this long rambling discussion of what, you know, what you seem to think somehow generates an inference, which I couldn't understand, right? But you didn't answer the question. And I warned you in advance, right? I said, look, you know, I'm just going to repeat the question at the end, right?
Right.
It wasn't like, it doesn't seem to me like you were even trying to answer my question. Now, why is it so difficult for you to explain to me? I just don't understand this. Why is it so difficult for you to explain to me what it is you think evidence is? Because I can't understand your claim. I can't understand your claim that something would be evidence for something else. In this case, finely tuned or apparently finely tuned psychophysical laws being evidence for a designer. I can't understand what that claim means unless I understand what you mean by evidence. You obviously have a non-standard view, right? Because the view of evidence that I've given is just a standard one in the philosophy of science and the philosophy of explanation. It's not tendentious. So you seem to be using evidence in some kind of proprietary way. That's perfectly fine, right? You can use it any way you like. I just want to know what it is that you understand evidence to be so we can evaluate your claim.
I don't. Okay, so I think that the relative superiority of one explanation over another, or over all other types of explanations that there would be evidence.
So you're using evidence to mean explanatory virtues. Is that the idea?
I think that could be part of an explanation.
Okay.